The first ships appeared on the horizon just after dawn, not as invaders. There was nothing martial in their silhouettes. They were long, low, their prows carved into the heads of creatures no one on the shore had ever seen. The fishermen along the Adriatic coast stopped mid-cast, watching the strange vessels glide toward the beach as if pulled by an invisible current. When the keels grated against the pebbles, the men who stepped out wore no armor. They carried tools, clay pots, bundles of seed grain. They looked inland with the expression of people who had already seen the place in a dream. This was not a conquest. This was a migration. And it would reshape Europe more thoroughly than any army that followed. You've heard the standard story, haven't you? That European civilization was built by the Romans, the Greeks, the Celts, by the civilizations whose monuments still stand. But before all of them, someone else laid the foundation, a people whose bones we find in the pollen layers and the mitochondrial DNA, whose language survives in words you use every single day. They built the first cities. They domesticated the first horses. They brought the Bronze Age to a continent covered in forest and mist. And then they vanished, not destroyed in battle, not absorbed by a stronger empire. They left no last stand, no final inscription. They simply stopped building, stopped migrating, stopped appearing in the archaeological record as a distinct people. What happened to them is the deepest mystery in European history, and the answer, buried in ice cores and ancient genomes, tells us something uncomfortable about how civilizations really die. If you've ever wondered whether a society can simply dissolve without war or plague, if you've ever felt that the history you were taught leaves out the most important pieces, then stay with me. Because what we're about to uncover begins in a place you've never thought to look. Let's go back to the beginning of the story, which means going back to the grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, around 3500 before Christ. Imagine it. No cities, no roads, no writing. Just an ocean of grass stretching from the Urals to the Carpathians, bending under wind that smelled of wild mint and horse sweat. This was the homeland of the Yamnaya people, named after the pit graves they carved into the earth. Yamna meaning pit in Russian. For generations, they were nomadic pastoralists, moving their herds with the seasons, trading copper and obsidian across distances that would astonish a Roman merchant. But they had something more valuable than metal. They had the horse. By 4000 BC, the Yamnaya had domesticated the horse, not just for meat or milk, but for travel. That changed everything. A man on foot can cover maybe 30 kilometers in a day. A man on horseback can cover 60, 70, 100, and carry supplies and return the next day, and expand the radius of contact by an order of magnitude. The Yamnaya became the first people in history to move across the continent faster than the weather could change. Now here's where the story gets strange. Around 3300 BC, something shifted. The Yamnaya began to move west, not as a single wave, but as a slow demographic pulse, generation by generation, family by family, moving their herds and their dead into the river valleys of Eastern Europe. By 2800 BC, they had reached the Danube. By 2500 BC, they had crossed the Carpathians, and wherever they went, the existing populations vanished. Does that sound like genocide to you? That's the easy explanation. And it's wrong. The archaeological record shows no mass graves, no burned settlements, no signs of warfare on a scale that could erase entire cultures. Instead, the Yamnaya spread something far more silent: their DNA. Genetic studies across hundreds of ancient skeletons show that within just a few centuries, the male lineage of the Yamnaya, the Y chromosome haplogroup R1b, replaced up to 90% of the indigenous male population in large parts of Europe. Not through slaughter, through something else entirely. What was it? A biological advantage? A social revolution? A disease they carried immunity to, which devastated their neighbors? The answer lies deeper than any single factor. Let's pause for a moment and feel the weight of that number again. 90% replacement. If you are a male of European descent and you take a genetic test, there is an overwhelming chance that your paternal line traces directly back to a Yamnaya man who lived around 4,500 years ago. That means that the languages you speak, English, German, French, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Persian, Greek, all of them descend from a single root language spoken by those same steppe herders. The Yamnaya didn't just vanish into Europe, they became Europe. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden threads that connect your own ancestry to the deep past, subscribe to this channel, because we are only beginning to trace the invisible lines that shaped your world. And I want to hear from you. Does knowing that your genetic line likely traces back to a single steppe culture change the way you see the map of Europe? Drop your answer in the comments. Start with the word steppe if you felt that shift. So why do we barely know their name? The forgotten principle here is something historians rarely discuss. The most profound transformations in human history are often invisible to the people undergoing them. The Yamnaya didn't set out to conquer Europe. They didn't have a king or a unified strategy. They were doing what pastoralists had always done, moving with their animals, seeking fresh pasture, burying their dead in the familiar earth. But because they arrived in Europe already adapted to a lifestyle that indigenous populations had never developed, milk digestion, horseback mobility, a social structure built around small, mobile family units, they simply out-reproduced everyone else. No war, no empire, just a quiet demographic tide that changed everything. If you're starting to feel that the way you've been taught about ancient history is missing the central mechanism, the slow, biological, almost geological forces that shape the fate of peoples, then you're already seeing what the textbooks leave out. I want you to remember that feeling in the comments. Tell me which civilization you think might have been quietly replaced without leaving a trace in the battles we remember. Because now, we have to ask the uncomfortable question. If the Yamnaya were so successful, why did they disappear? They didn't disappear immediately. For nearly 1,000 years, the Yamnaya cultural horizon dominated the steppe and the European river valleys. Their pottery styles spread from Hungary to Kazakhstan. Their burial rituals, bodies laid on their sides, knees drawn up, sprinkled with ochre, became the standard across an area larger than the Roman Empire at its height. They built the first wheeled vehicles we know of, solid wooden discs found in graves that suggest they were already moving heavy loads across the steppe routes. But then, around 2200 BC, something broke. The climate records tell us the story. Ice cores from Greenland and alpine glaciers show a sudden and severe drought event beginning around 2300 BC, a century-long dry period that scientists call the 4.2 kilo-year event. The Black Sea region, the very heart of Yamnaya territory, became dramatically drier. The grasslands that had supported their herds began to shrink. The rivers they depended on for summer pasture dried to trickles. This is the moment that the standard narrative gets wrong. Most histories treat climate as a slow backdrop, a contributing factor to collapse. But for the Yamnaya, there was no margin for error. Their entire social and economic system was calibrated to a specific rainfall pattern. When that pattern shifted, the chain reaction was not gradual. It was catastrophic. Herd sizes collapsed first. Without grass, the horses and cattle starved. Without horses, mobility collapsed. Without mobility, the Yamnaya could no longer maintain the wide trading networks that had kept their culture connected over vast distances. The steppe that had been their highway became a trap. The people who had once ranged from the Urals to the Danube were suddenly stranded, fragmented, trapped in shrinking pockets of viable land. If you are beginning to see that the real engine of history is not battles, but environmental stability and its fractures, then subscribe to this channel. We will keep following these paleoclimatic signatures to the forgotten heart of every civilization. I want you to think about your own region. What is the single resource that, if it disappeared, would fracture everything you rely on? Tell me in the comments. Use the word fragility so we can find each other's answers. And then the violence began. Not the epic, romanticized warfare of Bronze Age epic. Not armies clashing on open fields. The skeletons tell a different story. Forensic analysis of Yamnaya graves from the period shows a sharp increase in healed fractures, broken forearms from parrying blows, healed skull fractures, embedded arrowheads that had mended over years of survival. These were not soldiers. They were herders caught in cycles of raiding over the last remaining water sources. The culture that had spread through peaceful demographic advantage was now fighting for its life. By 1900 BC, the Yamnaya as a distinct archaeological culture had ceased to exist. No single battle, no dramatic collapse of a capital, just a slow starvation of the connections that held them together. Their descendants scattered, merged with other groups, adopted new pottery styles and burial rituals, and eventually became the ancestors of the Celts, the Italic tribes, the Greeks, the Indo-Iranians. They didn't vanish. They dissolved. And in dissolving, they became everyone. Now think about that for a moment. A people who remade the genetic and linguistic map of an entire continent, who laid the foundation for virtually every major European civilization that followed, are known only to specialists and archaeology enthusiasts. Their name appears in no textbook chapter titles. Their legacy is invisible, buried in the words you speak and the genes you carry. This is the first loop we need to close. The Yamnaya didn't disappear because they were weak. They disappeared because they were too successful. They expanded into an environmental niche that was stable for 1,000 years, built their entire civilization on that stability, and then watched it evaporate when the climate shifted. The forgotten principle is this: the most successful expansions create the most brittle structures. And what does that mean for us? Right now, the global food system depends on a handful of crops, a thin band of reliable climate, and an infrastructure of trade that has never been tested by a sustained disruption. We have built our civilization on the assumption that the climate will remain stable, just as the Yamnaya built theirs on the grasslands of the steppe. The ice cores tell us that stability is not the normal state of the Earth's climate. Stability is the exception. Does that feel like a reach to you? Let me show you exactly how close the parallel runs. The Yamnaya territory, at its peak, covered about 4 million square kilometers, roughly the land area of the European Union today. Their economy was almost entirely dependent on pasture and water availability. When the drought hit, they had no storehouses, no grain silos, no diversified economy to fall back on. Every herder had the same vulnerability. When the system failed, it failed everywhere at once. Modern civilization has more complexity, more buffers, more technology. But complexity itself creates hidden fragility, because the connections that make a system efficient also make it vulnerable to cascading failures. The Yamnaya couldn't import food from another region because there was no other region. They were the whole system. When the climate broke the steppe, they couldn't borrow resources from a different biome the way we can truck grain across a continent. But the principle remains. When a civilization's entire structure is optimized for one set of stable conditions, a change in those conditions becomes an existential threat. Not a slowdown, not a recession, a collapse of the identity itself. We are now approaching the climax of this story, the moment where the vanished people leave us a message we can't ignore. Let's go back to the grass. On the modern Ukrainian and Russian steppes, archaeologists have found over 2,000 Yamnaya burial mounds, kurgans they're called, each one marking a single person or family group. These mounds are the only large structures the Yamnaya left behind, and inside them, under layers of earth and stone, the evidence of their last days is written in the orientation of the skeletons, the offerings placed beside them, the wear on their teeth and joints. Here's what the bones tell us about the final years. The children buried in the last generation of Yamnaya kurgans show lines of enamel hypoplasia, defects in tooth development caused by severe malnutrition during infancy. Their mothers were starving while they nursed. The adults show patterns of repetitive work far more intense than earlier generations. They were walking longer distances, carrying heavier loads, processing less nutritious food that took more effort to prepare. These were not people who went quietly into extinction. They were people who fought, who walked, who carried their children through drought, who buried their dead with the same rituals their ancestors had used for 1,000 years, even as the world they knew was dying around them. And then, nothing. No more kurgans. The tradition ends. The people who had built the first version of a connected Europe simply stopped marking their dead in the earth. Before this story closes, if you want to understand how the most profound vanishings leave no ruins, but remake everything, subscribe now. Because the next civilization we will uncover followed the same pattern, and its traces are hidden in plain sight. Here is my final question for you in this episode. What tradition in your own life would, if it ended abruptly, be the sign that something deeper had shifted? Write "end of the kurgan" in the comments if you felt the weight of that silence. But they were still there. Their genes continued in the populations that survived. Their horses spread across the continent. Their wheeled vehicles became the template for everything from Roman chariots to medieval carts. Their language, the language that would become Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, English, Russian, never died. It just changed, as all living languages do, adapting to new environments, new peoples, new gods. The Yamnaya didn't vanish because they were replaced. They vanished because they became universal. This is the deeper truth that the standard historical narrative misses. Civilizations don't disappear like a light being switched off. They dissolve like salt in water, invisible to the naked eye, but forever changing the composition of everything that follows. The Yamnaya are not a lost people. They are the invisible substrate of Europe. You carry them in your blood, in your speech, in the shape of your society. And that brings us to the second loop that needs to close. Remember the question I opened with? The people who built Europe and then vanished. The mystery is not that they left no trace. The mystery is that they left nothing but traces, so thorough that we stopped recognizing them as a separate people. The Yamnaya built a system so successful that the system absorbed them. They expanded into Europe not as conquerors, but as seeds. And when the climate changed, the seeds didn't die. They just sprouted into something new. The Celts, the Italic tribes, the Greeks, the Indo-Iranians, all of them are the Yamnaya, reshaped by new environments, new neighbors, new pressures. The vanishings was not an end. It was a transformation. If this has changed the way you think about what it means for a civilization to disappear, if you've started to wonder what invisible foundations your own society is built on, drop your answer below. Tell me what civilization you think might be vanishing right now without anyone noticing, because it's becoming too successful to see. Because the final lesson of the Yamnaya is this: the most powerful forces in history are the ones you stop seeing because they become the ground you stand on. The last kurgan was raised around 1900 years before Christ. The grass grew over it. The wind erased the tracks of the last herd moving west. The people who wore ochre on their bones and rode horses across the plain became the people who built Athens, who wrote the Vedas, who marched with Caesar's legions, who settled the forests of Scandinavia, who crossed the Atlantic in ships that would have looked like magic to their ancestors. They are not gone. They are still building. And the question the ice cores leave us with is not what happened to them. It's what happens when the ground the next civilization stands on begins to shift.